In our last video for this session, let's talk about working with types and converting type. The truth is that because Python is strongly typed, we must frequently convert type when working with data. Data comes to us in one form and we need to transform it into another form. We're going to be doing this with type conversion. We're also going to be doing this when we're building up containers, and we'll be doing it really throughout this course, taking data from one form and converting it into another form. Converting type is the most basic way to convert data. You have data that really ought to be a different type. Why? Because when the type you're working with is inappropriate for what you're trying to do, then you need to. You'll say, well, this came to me as a string, but I really want to treat it like a number, so I'm going to convert it to an int or a float. So it's essential that you always know what type you're working with. Line by line, statement by statement, your program is going to be working with different kinds of objects of different types. If you don't know what type you're working with, you can easily run into problems. But you also won't know what that type, what you can do with that object if you don't know its type. So let's do a little bit of a review just to demonstrate this, because although we've only learned a few things so far, we do know that type matters when working with, let's say, these operators, the plus operator and the times operator. Now, when you start working through the quiz, you're going to be able to answer questions like the ones I'm about to ask very easily. The question really would be, in this particular program, what do you expect to see when you run the program? And if you want, you can pause the video and see if you can remember. If not, no problem at all. Well, let's just do it mentally. We have two integers. We're adding them with a plus. That's the easiest one because it relates to math. You know that two integers added together is going to produce a new integer with the values summed. So we have 10 here. What about 5 plus 5 on line 5 here? We've got two strings. The two strings are being concatenated in this case. The plus operator with strings indicates concatenation. So we should see 5, 5 here. Here we're going to see 10, and here we should see 5, 5. Notice I'm not calling it 55 because it's not an integer. It's a string with two characters. What about this last one? Do you recall? When we take a string and multiply it by an integer, we get back a new string with that string value repeated the specified number of times. This is how the times operator works. We could run this just to satisfy our incessant need to be sure. And we see 10, 55, and 55555. Great. So we know how these operators work. We're going to get into a situation, though, where the value that comes to us is not what we want. Sometimes I say, well, let's say that you had a string and you wanted to double that number. What would you do then? A lot of folks will say, well, I would just take the quotes away. If I wanted to double this number, I would take the quotes away, right? Because as you know, if I do this, if I wanted to double this number and I'm expecting to get 10, I'm not going to get 10. I'm going to get 55, right? Okay, so what does that mean for us? It means that we need to convert x into a string. Now again, some folks will just say, well, I'll just take the quotes out. No, that won't be your option, because a lot of times the values that come to us are not literals in our code. They're not literally written in our code, something we call literals. Instead, they may come to us as the result of a function call. Now, let's say we were writing a program and we wanted to take input from the user, and then whatever that input was, we'd want to make sure it was an integer, or we'd want to assume it was an integer, that we would double that value. So if they put in 10, we'd like to see 20. If they put in 5, we'd like to see 10. How are we going to do this? The first question, though, is what type does input return? Now, you're going to memorize this using the quizzing app, but of course, if we're interested in knowing and we're not sure, we can ask the interpreter to tell us. So even though I gave it an integer, and of course that prompt asking for an integer is just window dressing, it's not really affecting any part of the code. But even though I typed 55, input did not return that value as an integer. Why? Because input always returns a string. Why does input always return a string? You know, the easiest answer is to say, because that's just how it works. Probably the more straightforward answer or more reasonable answer is, look, input is just taking keyboard input. It's taking whatever characters you type. We want to make sure input's going to be consistent. What we especially don't want is some special rules that, hey, if you type a number, it'll convert it to a number. If you type a string, it'll convert it to a string. Instead, input will always return a string, always. That's what input does. It returns a string. So let's talk about our problem here. How are we going to solve the problem of the user typed an integer, or what looked like an integer, but as you know, it's a string, and we now want to double that string? How are we going to do that? I don't know, you tell me. No, the way we're going to do that is by using the conversion functions. So which conversion function converts an object into an integer? Well, all you have to do is ask, what is the name of an integer? What is Python's name for an integer? It's int, int. And you also need to reflect that every single type has a function that will convert to that type. So all we need to do is convert x into xi. And if we print the type of xi, we should see that it is, as long as I save it. In fact, why don't I print xi, and then I'll print the type of xi. Uh, 55. Okay. So now I typed something into the keyboard. Input returned it as a string. That string got converted to an integer. I printed the integer, as you can see, 55, and I verified the type of xi by printing the type of xi. That indicated to me that xi is an integer, which means that I should be able to safely double this value. So I can say xid equals xi times 2, print xid. So if I put in 5, I should see 10. Oh, better save my work. There's 10 at the bottom there. And if I put in 10, I should see 20, etc. Okay, so this is a very simple problem. What you'll do in the project will be a little more elaborate. You'll just need to realize that sometimes an object needs to be a string and sometimes it needs to be an integer. In the project, you're going to be asked to convert input into an integer so you can use it in a math expression. But then you're going to be asked to get the length of an integer, which you can't get the len of an integer. What do you get the len of? A string. So you'll have to convert that integer to a string so you can get its length, and the project description will take you from there.